Thank you for listening to the Public Rail Now podcast. As always, I'm your host, Adam. On this episode, we're excited to bring Vinnie Collins on the program to talk about his recent article in Jacobin about democratic public ownership. We also talk about his research about renewable energy, the labor movement, and much more. The link to Vinnie's article is in the episode description, and I highly encourage you to read it. If you're passionate about the work that we do at Public Rail Now, including this podcast, and want to support us, please consider making a donation or becoming a sustainer. We're a small team with limited resources, but our mission to make public ownership of the railroads a reality is a critical one, and we need all the help we can get. For more information about Public Rail Now, please visit publicrailnow.org.
Yeah, my name's Vinnie Collins. I'm a PhD candidate at York University in my sixth, in which I hope is my final year. I'm just writing up at the moment, trying to get finished. And yeah, as you'll hear from the accent, I'm not from Toronto, I'm from Scotland. So that kind of, obviously, my research, I look at Scotland and I look at New York. But yeah, funnily, I actually don't look at buses, although I obviously have an interest in the importance of public transit, and that kind of comes out of actually my father-in-law has been a bus driver his whole life and constantly kind of talked about the problems of the bus company. And then it kind of sprung out from that. I kind of seen the story in the newspapers of the kind of the CEO of FUS not only cutting the night route, which is obviously critical for hospitality workers, critical for working class people in the city, and they announced cutting that, and then after the backlash to that, came up with a CEO kind of response which was to ask for a designated driver for either a worker who could drive the bus or to have someone on a night out, which in Glasgow is a tough sell, so yeah, I think that kind of sparked my interest in obviously the kind of pieces about public democratic ownership, and in my research, that's the kind of thing that ties all the cases together is the importance of public democratic ownership.
Yeah, thank you so much, and definitely want to get more into that as we go on. But one of the reasons I reached out was you wrote this fantastic article in Jacobin, and in this article you talk about public democratic ownership, why it's important, why it's the direction we need to move in. And one of the things you mention is that the climate crisis is heightening the cost of living crisis. Can you tell our listeners more about this connection?
Yeah, definitely. So not the kind of first to come up with it, and obviously there's been like a lot of great work done on kind of fighting this and tying this together in terms of a kind of working class climate politics. But yeah, I think that it's a massive question, and there's a number of ways in which the climate crisis is heightening the cost of living crisis. I think very kind of straightforwardly, if you look at any kind of climate disasters that are happening, the communities that they're destroying are predominantly working class communities that are getting hit hardest and first by climate change. You look at the kind of cost of repairs, the kind of insurance corporations making out like bandits, and yeah, this is all to the detriment of working class people. Then another way is the kind of disruption of supply chains, right? And we've seen that, and we've seen that a lot in recent years, which pushes up the price of oil and gas. So like the price at the pumps for working class people. You look at the way food is kind of increasing the cost there. And then I think the kind of trickier stuff is a lot of what's going on. You know, there's an interesting kind of conversation about, what is the state of play right now of the energy transition. Even kind of, are we in an energy transition? And folks at Trade Union Energy for Energy Democracy, to Ed, Sean Sweeney and the likes, have a good article where they talk about, the fact that this is much more like an energy addition, with the kind of so-called decarbonised economy, and what we're actually seeing as energy expansion. So we see this in government policy, so policies such as the carbon tax, these kind of regressive taxations that have the likes of me and you taxed at the same kind of rate as billionaires, which is completely bonkers. And then we have like companies obviously greenwashing, right? Like the cost here in Toronto might not seem much, but the cost of a plastic bag, that's complete greenwashing. That's not reducing emissions in any way. These plastics are still going to dumps, but that's just a way that a corporation sees a way of making more money out of the public. And then, like, where we do see climate mitigation, and a lot more of the time, what we see is adaptation. But where we do see these kind of efforts to do stuff, and where we do have good examples of like governments actually taking the climate crisis serious, what we see is like this is happening on the backs of working class people. That it's not the kind of billionaires, and it's not being passed off through taxation of the richest in society. And so it's working class people that are fitting that bill. And basically in that piece, I'm kind of arguing that this doesn't have to be that way. And obviously that's a kind of common argument that we all kind of can see, but it's also, turning working class people rightly away from climate policies. And if we need to build, a working class power block to force governments to make this change, then we need to fight for policies that are not on the back of working class people.
I think that's such an important point because, like you're describing, a lot of the times we see from these large corporations and, people that are a part of the ruling class is even in the sort of propaganda and, ideology that they put out, it presents, actually tackling the climate change problem, which is an existential one.
Right.
They frame it in a way that it makes it seem like, oh well, if we do anything about it, you're the ones that are going to have to suffer for it. So in the way you've described, um, the regressive taxation and everything, it reminds me. I always bring up the example of the sales tax in the States is like, if
Right.
I go into a store and buy a carton of eggs and Elon Musk goes into a store and buys a carton of eggs, we
Right.
pay the same sales tax. That's like a completely regressive tax.
Yeah. 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 No, and it's something that, we often hear this kind of condensation in the way working class people, but people see it and know what's going on. It's very obvious that that what's going on with those regressive taxes, but it's the kind of politics like you're being offered, that we know right now is on offer, is this kind of greenwashing or climate denialism, and most people are just tuning out of that politics together. So that's where I kind of, there's obviously, and we'll get into this more, I'm sure, but that's where I kind of see the role of Labour.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the really important things that you mentioned, and something that I think is so, I mean, it's very interesting and something that I think people notice on a day-to-day basis, but they might not be able to articulate it maybe. But you mentioned that after 40 years of neoliberalism, many public entities function like private corporations, prioritizing revenue over public service. So, how has that logic of neoliberalism invaded these public spaces, and what are some of the observable consequences of that invasion?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's a great question, and yeah, I think it's the the, the kind of getting this across is actually quite difficult because there's a kind of fetishization of that we nationalize everything, and there's this kind of nationalise and return to the kind of 70s, the post-war boom. But obviously, there's no return to that, and that moment led those contradictions from that moment led to neoliberalism. So I think yeah, it's a really important topic, and I think the kind of way that we see this play out, I talk about the MTA, the Metropolitan Transport Authority in New York, that has functioned like this, but here in Canada, we have Quebec Hydro, that basically functions, for all intents and purposes, as a private entity. It's within the kind of capitalist profit motive logic. And I think this is like a really key point that we need to that comes up a lot in my research in Scotland. This idea that every like in Scotland, it's in some senses it's a nice terrain because you rarely run into someone that's against public ownership, because they say Thatcher, privatization, absolutely not. So public ownership is popular, but then the limits to the way they talk about public ownership, and to be fair, the way public ownership has been used has been like a backstop to ensure that profits are maintained, and to ensure that these businesses run the way they had. But there is certainly an alternative way of doing that, and I think that has to include the democratic planning part of the public democratic ownership, to have public democratic ownership as part of a planned economy. So one of the things in the public power New York that I was kind of taken by was the idea of the New York Power Authority, as kind of one of the nation's most financially stable and well positioned utilities. That has also functioned as basically like a private utility for since its inception, but it does benefit from very low borrowing costs, and it has own sorry to its kind of ability to issue tax exempt bonds. So one of the things that the Bill Public Renewables Act does, that is, we'll use these powers, we'll use this leverage to in a publicly and democratic way, but we have these levers that have not been touched, that the MTA also have similar levers. So yeah, basically what I'm arguing is that it's not sufficient to just have public ownership. We need to use these levers that are available to build the capacity of public entities. And the kind of inspiration I kind of take from the public power campaign as well was, not only do they have a vision that this is building public democratic ownership, but it's also getting unionized workers buy-in, incentivize workers to actually build more renewable energy, creating that capacity. So I think that's a key part of this that's kind of been lost, that there is a lack of capacity within these kind of public state enterprises, and that's the kind of neoliberal logic that's very pervasive, that we need to fight back. But again, that is going to be a lot of hard work, and that's taking like a lot of kind of real organising within the kind of Build Public Renewables campaign. But I think that's something that they're really taking serious, and I think that we need to take serious. There's plenty of public ownership in Canada, but I don't think it's a kind of click our fingers and we just create more public ownership and everything's going to be okay. I think we need real public democratic ownership.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a crucial point that you make about public institutions acting as sort of a backstop for the shortcomings of the private sector. And that's,
Right,
in thinking about the example of the United States, I think, to its credit, the New Deal, it wasn't perfect by any means, and its benefits were unequally distributed. But it did do a lot of good for working people in the United States. But Roosevelt famously said that he saved capitalism by putting forth the New Deal. So
right,
it's this logic of public institutions just exist to plug the holes where private enterprise isn't interested in in assisting. But
right.
to go back to the question of renewable energy, that's been a focus of your research, and you specifically have been taking a look at offshore wind and other forms of renewable energy, and you know what has your research shown about the limitations of our reliance on the private sector in these areas, especially in terms of tackling the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think like I borrow from Brett Christophers, who wrote a great book. Yeah, 2024 that was called "The Price Is Wrong: Why Capitalism Can't Save the Planet." And yeah, I kind of like take from his book this idea that the private for profit model cannot build at the scale necessary, and he kind of shows this in a very concrete way, showing that the subsidies that are given are basically not enough. It's not a profitable enough entity in the same way that oil and gas was. So, I mean, in that sense, it's perfect for public democratic ownership who can take on some of those costs and are better able to navigate that terrain. But yeah, I think like when I was actually doing my field work in New York, it was around the time of a lot of the kind of cancellation of these projects, and so I look at a coalition called Climate Jobs New York. It's a Labour coalition who have been very successful at unionising offshore wind, and I can go more into some of that. And certainly there are large parts that I don't want to be all negative, and there are large parts that they've done well, but I think it is kind of crucial to look at the limits of the kind of privatized model. So they've made these project labor agreements on these contracts with a lot of the time it's a lot like in offshore wind, it's Danish public ownership, which again I can kind of talk about some of that in terms of not being a kind of something that we should also be desiring. But like that, these were contracts that they had secured, and I think it was enough offshore wind energy that would power homes until 2040, I think it was, in New York, which was incredible. But a lot of these contracts were falling through because the corporations were basically saying, we're not making enough profit. You need to give us further investment. You need to give us more and more subsidies. Exactly what Brett Christophers shows in his book. And this was really like interesting happening in real time, and there was like a real worry that this will continue. Now we've kind of seen the impacts of Donald Trump, and that throws up all sorts of different issues, but kind of further in issues. But the wind industry is in a lot of problems. But like I kind of argue that the only way kind of through this is through public democratic ownership of offshore wind. That if we don't have that kind of democratic planning, and we leave it up to the market, then we're just going to continue to see these private corporations make further demands, and we're going to have these kind of the offshore wind that that is so necessary to a decarbonised and to a just transition. We're going to continue to see these key parts fall apart. These key parts of climate mitigation fall apart because of that profit motive. So yeah, it's a really interesting moment that we're in. But that was in 2024 that I was in New York, kind of as that was happening. So we're kind of still living with that, and I think a lot of the kind of offshore wind that is promised to and being built just now in New York, it wouldn't take much in terms of more kind of issues with supply chain or another kind of financial crash, and these industries would be, in a terrible state, in an even worse state than they're in. So again, I'm kind of putting forward that this needs to lead to a real focus on public democratic ownership.
Yeah, and you know the democratic part of that is, of public democratic ownership is really, as you've been saying, the critical piece, because there are public institutions, and like we've been saying, they more or less most of the time act as a sort of backstop for the limitations of the private sector. But one of the things that we have been pushing with Public Rail now is that we're not simply talking about the nationalization of the railroads, which would still be a massive improvement for
Yeah,
the United States, because I've said it a million times, but it's an anomaly in that it's lock, stock, and barrel owned by private corporations. So nationalization would, on its own, would be an improvement, but the big part is giving workers and their unions a direct say, and giving the public a direct say in what is prioritized and how it operates. And so let's get into this democratic public ownership. Like, what does that look like, whether in theory or practice, and in what ways can publicly owned democratized entities intervene in an economy to serve the public good? Especially what power does that democracy element give these public institutions, um, to actually correct a lot of the errors that are being made in the name of profit?
yeah, yeah. No, it's an excellent question, and yeah, something I'm thinking a lot about, because I don't want to give the idea that there's a silver bullet here with public democratic ownership. Far from it. It just offers the potential, right? The potential of prioritizing the public good over profit, which a private entity doesn't. But then that needs to be something in capacity that is built and maintained and institutionalized. And it's also a tough question, because there's not a lot of good examples, if any. A lot of people point to cooperatives, but obviously cooperatives don't challenge the kind of capitalist relations. And then there's community ownership, which there's a lot of really incredible work going on in Scotland around community ownership. But I think that's a scale question that we need to kind of return to. The work, the task at hand, if you like, is huge. And I think this is something that we need the levers of the state for. And we need to have a real conversation about what it means to transform the state, and what a powerful labour movement, and ultimately a political party that wins power and kind of leverages these powers. So I think first of all, our labour movement needs to be like a lot more. We need to critical, like why I argue that labour unions are so important is because of that kind of democratic ethos within labour unions. But obviously, that's in reality, we have a lot of top down labour unions. So I think the democratic part has to be a central pillar. So I would envisage that. And your question about like what it would look like in, I suppose that's the theory part, and what it would look like in practice. From a postdoc application, I want to look at Green Jobs Oshawa, which is a example here in Ontario, and so this was a grassroots organisation that came about, and they were made of union members, but also community members, the local community, the local other kind of components of the labour movement. And that was basically at that time the General Motors factory. General Motors had basically announced that they were closing the Oshawa plant, which was at one point the largest car manufacturing plant in North America. And these folks came together, and they basically, at this moment where their jobs were threatened, and they came up with the idea that we can't stand back, and we actually need to reimagine ecological production. What does that mean? And there was a plan, to transform the to convert the plant into making electric vehicles. But it didn't just stop at that. It wasn't. It didn't want to. I mean, to come to a lot of the important work that you do. It also wanted to challenge this kind of like neoliberal, individualized kind of car ownership conception, which does not serve working class people, and it wanted to challenge that, and actually, like, what would it be like to build and reimagine like free universal public transit? A lot of people use cars, and like completely understandably, but it's out of necessity. It's because we don't have a subway line that runs close to us, or a bus that was part of the Zora and Mandani campaign to have like fast and free buses. People take their car because there aren't these alternatives. So I think that was an incredible plan that was unfortunately unsuccessful. But I think there's a lot of lessons in there for how we can, change the role of government, of state, and transform the sector and the economy as a whole, and providing and kind of guaranteeing these jobs. So they were kind of coming up with plans that they would start with Canada Post, and they would electrify the fleet. So that again, that was very much a democratic process. That it was like, okay, let's start by having the Canadian Post fleet, and that would be converted to like electric vehicles, and then we would work our way through a lot of these public institutions, and so yeah, I think that democratic, to kind of come back to your original question, realizing I'm kind of off in a tangent here, but I think the kind of democratic point of it is to give working class people more control and more power, and put the power in the hands of working class people. And I think that kind of means that we're going to have like a much more political, vibrant life than we have right now. We don't have the union halls as we did have. We don't have public spaces where people are going and having these conversations. So I think the task is huge. Obviously, I don't want to underplay that, but I think there is a lot of kind of opportunity, and there is the need. We live in an unbelievably isolated world, where people are desperate for community. So I think like building those spaces, those democratic spaces, is really important.
Yeah, and speaking of the labor movement, because I'm really glad you mentioned, like, there was a time when, whether it's in the States or like around the world, um, I mean, we've seen union membership in decline, and there's been that, along with that, it seems that there's this restriction of these common spaces that I'm blanking on who I was talking to at the time, but I was having a conversation and somebody mentioned, there was a time when you would go to the labor hall for your wedding, You know, you
Right.
would go to the labor hall for your kids' birthdays, or like it was there was a vibrant culture that went around the labor movement, and being a part of this, like you've described, like this, it is democratic. And I mean, there's, and I if there are studies showing that unions, people that are in unions, union members, people that are participating in the labor movement are much more fortified against things like, whether it's, engaging in this sort of far right, conspiratorial, thinking, or this neoliberal individualism. Being in a union, being a part of the labor movement, it protects people against these undemocratic, authoritarian sort of, um impulses that people that are in, like you mentioned, like we are all, because of, a multitude of factors, isolated, separate from one another,
Right.
alienated. And the labor movement has been, throughout history, this force that breaks down barriers between people. And that's, this, the whole idea of solidarity is all about. And you, in your article, you write that no social actor is more consequential to shaping a just energy transition than labor unions. So, I mean, in addition to maybe some of the things that I had mentioned, what is it about the labor movement that gives it such a powerful position in shaping and even directing where we go from here, like in the transition to renewables and in all these other areas as well?
Yeah, yeah, great question. Yeah, I think it's ultimately, I think first of all to kind of be sober about yeah, and you kind of provided this context right about where the labour movement is. We do have a real issue of our kind of labour movement in some unions like turning to the right, and there's examples of that here in Canada and elsewhere, and so a lot of this work is no longer being done. But I do think again that ultimately kind of taken from Matt Huber, talks about the kind of labour movement has the ability to cause a crisis for capitalism, right? By shutting down production. I think that is unique leverage that the labour movement still holds. I think your point about where the labour movement historically has been, I think not just being a part of every part of life, and being that kind of social actor is critical. Uh, and yeah, I think you know, despite like a lot of kind of heroic victories over the last few years, uh, right now, Labour is still in a kind of moment where it's like you said, losing density, and but I do think Labour at its best can be representative of the working class, and we have seen this, and there's no reason why it can't happen again. I think it's going to take a lot of organising. I think this idea of wall to wall organising is really important. I think there's been a real slip, understandably, to focusing on narrow victories like wages and so on. I think we need to get back to fighting on broader issues. I mean, there's an excellent argument that that is made, that these broader issues, international solidarity, are actually what build and make the labour movement. I'm thinking of the issue of Palestine. That there's a very good argument that the international solidarity, like we're seeing with Palestine, hasn't been a part of the labour movement for the last 40 years. But now we have like workers working hard and putting through hot cargo resolutions, shutting down. There was the strike in California around that, and I think that yeah, there's a really good argument. Rafif Ziad and Adam Hani making a recent pamphlet they write with Richard Cox. I think it's Richard, and they kind of argue that these broader issues such as Palestine, international solidarity, are actually freeing and are actually transforming the labour movement. And I find that a very kind of compelling argument, and that's exactly the kind of like fronts that we need to be fighting on. This kind of idea that you mentioned of solidarity, it doesn't stop, doesn't have like doesn't isn't constrained by borders. It's really important that an injury to one is an injury to all, as the saying goes. And then there's the kind of other aspect of it, which I think again can be very overlooked, which is and I know the kind of with regards to the decarbonisation and the transition that is needed, that there's no kind of industry that's going to be outside of this. It's kind of like everything is going to have to be transformed. But I think these specific strategic sectors that Matt Huber talks about, building trades, electricity, we need to like see in these important skills that these workers have, and they need to be utilized. It's going to be these workers who build this decarbonised economy. It's them that are going to be operating these wind turbines, or retrofitting homes to conserve energy, and it's them that have these expertise. So again, that's another part of it. We are not getting that kind of political education, that kind of like rank and file voice is being excluded a lot, from these kind of conversations. So I think it's important that a critical kind of element to the fact that I think like unions are so consequential in shaping the just transition is exactly that. That they have this this important and kind of expertise that we need to learn from.
100%. And I think, that's something that I feel in my research about the labor movement and unions. In that research often involves kind of looking at where the labor movement's at now. A lot of the focus that I have has been mostly in the States because that's where I live, and so I
Yeah.
feel more open to being able to criticize anything from the States, like versus internationally, because I what can I say, I don't live in these other places. But this history of the labor movement has been extinguished. I mean, even thinking back to during the U.S. Civil War, for example, there were workers in factories in England and in France. Like, even though they might have their livelihoods might have been impacted negatively by the cutting off the slave system in the plantation South, that was transporting cotton to England, for example.
Mm,
These workers still said, no, we don't care if we are negatively impacted in terms of not having enough work or what have you. Slavery's wrong.
right,
It's like
right,
the self-sacrifice of solidarity, and that has gone on during uh what the horrible things that were going on, as the United States was funding the Contras. There are old
right,
union buttons that say labor against the Contras.
right,
There's labor against apartheid. The labor coming out and saying, no, the system of apartheid in South Africa is unacceptable. We as workers, as a part of the international working class, must stand against it. And I think you're
right,
absolutely right in pointing out that in terms of whether it's the genocide against the people of Palestine, and all these other crimes that are going on around the world, it's not only a mistake, but it's in a lot of ways suicidal for the working class to kind of have this isolationist, economistic kind of like,
yeah,
all we care about is the bread and butter issues. Everything else that's not within our wheelhouse. Like, that's whereas, like you mentioned, actually labor unions have this strategic position in the center of where the contradictions of capitalism occur in the workplace. They're
Exactly.
strategically
Yeah.
placed there to answer those questions. But not to go off on a whole tangent here, but just very
No,
excited
no.
about the things you've been saying. But um, you also make this observation about labor's engagement in the climate crisis, and that it comes mostly in the form of what are called social partnerships. And basically, like, well, what are those social partnerships, and what are the shortcomings of that model, and what might a better alternative look like?
Yeah, yeah, it's something that you know. I think the labor movement is. I mean, it's certainly not a monolith, but certainly here in Canada, and yeah, I think like over my interviews, there's almost this like fetishization of like a fetishism of like social partnerships, and they will talk about Germany's like tripartite system as the kind of like that's exactly where we need to get to. And I think uh you know we need to be at, you hear these things like we need to be at the table, if we're not at the table, blah blah blah, like we're toast. And yeah, I think seeing social partnerships more as a class alliance with capital, and this is again kind of borrowing from critical research, but seeing those as like they're completely like it's a contradiction to think we can sit around the table with union busting corporations, and ask them for a piece of the pie. It's not worked over the last 40 years, and it's not going to work because they are set out to decimate. They don't want unions to exist, and they will do everything they can to continually attack them. So, and I think even when they're kind of brought to the table kicking and screaming, we have this Just Transition Commission in Scotland, and Labour has 4 seats at this table, of I think it's either 12 or 14, but it's a small minority. And a lot of the trade unions reps I spoke to on it are just like very kind of pessimistic. That's just kind of dictated to them, as their kind of voice just being there's a real like worry of co-optation. And yeah, I think a lot of like people seek out the kind of like tripartite system, but it kind of completely ignores that it also instills this capitalist notion of competition that again we want to do the exact opposite. We want solidarity. We don't believe in competition, and it kind of takes that for granted that like we are going to fight over capitalist kind of investment, in that. We see this a lot with the offshore wind industry. In my own research, there's this kind of like notion that like why can't we just have a offshore wind sector? Like why right now is the Scottish government creating these green ports, which are like basically wild west of labour laws, where labour law basically doesn't exist, which was interestingly brought in a coalition with the Green Party. So there's your kind of greenwashing box ticked. But yeah, they basically brought these in, and have completely ignored, and totally turned their back on the idea that we as the labor movement shouldn't be building into this ethos. We should be, what does it look like for international solidarity across the supply chains? What does it look like to turn the tide on this race to the bottom? To Scotland just now, the labour unions are kind of fighting for a piece of the pie, but what does it look like to there's a famous kind of Scottish communist Jimmy Reid, who had this really, I mean, famous in Scotland quote about the kind of like the problem with the rat race is we're all rats, you know, and I think that is like very true of social partnerships. Like the fact is, we are all kind of corporate actors, capitalist actors fighting over these kind of small pieces of the pie, and then ultimately we're left to the whims of profit when these industries are taken away, when they're no longer profitable, and then what happens to workers. I think in terms of a better alternative look like, I think it's like seeing these corporations for what they are. That like labor unions need to be absolutely antagonistic to the General Motors of this world, to these corporate entities like Orsted, who, although they're state owned, again, private corporations for all intents and purposes. They need to be completely antagonistic. They need to focus on building the power to bring these corporations kicking and screaming, and deliver on their promises of good paying unionized jobs. And it's not just about jobs, it's also like there needs to be a broader project there that ties into, you know, as I kind of talked about, a political party, and Labour movement can't do this on their own. But I think again, there is room for that, and there is there is space for Labour to do that, but it's going to take a lot of organising, and I think it needs to start with, like, you know, fighting against this idea that competition, which is built into these social partnerships, that competition is taken for granted. That, you know, some of us in Scotland might get a few unionised jobs, but parts of the global south don't get jobs, or parts of North America don't get jobs, or whatever. There is a much more kind of internationalist route. It might be a much harder fight. It might be a much longer fight, and again, this is something that I know a lot of us are kind of grappling with, the kind of boot on our neck of the climate crisis, and the constant time limits that we're given. But I think if it's going to be a truly just transition, then these are the fights that it needs to be an internationalist fight, that we need to be building that solidarity across the supply chains.
And there's the old famous saying about how the struggle is international, but it starts at the national level. And you
Exactly.
use the example of Scotland, um, talking about how privatization has been such a disaster for working people, and as well as using Scotland as a blueprint, or at least a source of some lessons that we can take about public democratic ownership. And so, can you tell our listeners about what happened in Scotland, and with privatization, and how the Scottish trade unions actually responded to it, and uh, put forth a different vision, very drastically different vision than what was implemented under privatization?
No, Scotland's a really kind of interesting case study. Again, like most economies, neoliberalism, uh, you know, neoliberal policies where privatization, deregulation, attacks on the trade union movement. And yeah, in Scotland, it was particularly severe. And yeah, I think areas such as like coal mining, and you know, there's a kind of like anecdote that a lot of that, the coal mining is a perfect example of an unjust transition, right? Like whole communities decimated, whole like communities where people's livelihoods and housing were and there's been a lot kind of written on the way deindustrialization, you know, like hit Scotland, and in other parts of like north of England and other parts of the UK. And yeah, I think in Scotland again, when you think of privatisation, you think of like energy, British Gas, or telecoms with British Telecoms, or even more recently the privatisation of Royal Mail, right? That was the Cameron government, coalitional government, that that brought in that privatisation. But I do think like buses have been neglected in this conversation, and yeah, like I say, I'm not an expert in buses and public transit, but yeah, I think the kind of facts do speak for themselves with regards to the disaster of privatisation. There's a great report that I use in the article by the Scottish Trade Union Congress, the STUC, and they kind of show that yeah, the ridership is down 43% over the last like 40 years. Fares are up 159%. Cuts to services have just become the norm. And you know, despite like some Scottish government uh, like uh, like subsidisation and you know like some things that here even in Canada I would you know be delighted to win, such as like under 18s have free bus, over 65 buses are free, but the subsidies have been like humongous, like to the to First Bus, the largest kind of bus corporation, and you know I think it's like I was kind of getting at earlier. I think Scotland is kind of interesting because of the way public ownership is talked about, that people kind of take it for granted that of course it's a good thing, and the unions have been very strong and forthright and continually pass motions for public ownership. But I think there are lessons from the way it's kind of talked about, and I kind of come back to what we talked about earlier. There's the kind of idea that it's a backstop. There's you know, Scotland had for like a second Scottish National Energy Company. Again, this was pushed by Labour and other critical movements. But during the pandemic, it was kind of like thrown under the rug, and it never really came to see the light of day. But even that idea was that the Scottish government would, in amongst a kind of sea of private utilities, that the Scottish government would fund this public energy company. And so it was kind of setting it up to fail. Obviously, that would have then, you know, meant that would have, you know, justified their decision not to have public ownership, because obviously, if this public utility is basically in the rat race, if you like, of of the market, privatized capitalist market economy, and it doesn't receive the kind of subsidization or anything, then it's going to lose. So even if it was kind of not thrown under the rug, I think this kind of this kind of having, you know, a public utility in amongst a sea of private utilities won't work. So it really kind of calls for the importance of public democratic ownership, and here like I really think that it needs to be seen as a kind of like reformist reform, and the idea that, you know, that it is not buying into the capitalist profit motive, that public democratic ownership can challenge capitalism. It's not a silver bullet, as I've talked about before, but that there is the opportunity, there is the potential there. And so I think Scotland's like interesting that it has that support. So then I think with further organisation, then it doesn't have the animosity. There's not the kind of like, you know, labour law that you have in New York, the Wagner Act, which makes public utilities don't have the right to strike, right? Which is obviously something that's really tough to get to bring members along in terms of like public democratic ownership. It makes that hard in New York, but Scotland doesn't have that. So the terrain's a bit better and the support's there. I think there's just the opportunity to bring in that plus, which I'm sure I'll get to talking about the kind of climate element and the importance of that.
Yeah, actually, that was my next question was about how you've stated that trade unions have yet to develop a vision of public ownership that centers democratic ownership and makes the connection to climate action. So I definitely want to ask you about that. It's funny you bring up the Wagner Act, like because the National Labor Relations Act, aka the Wagner Act, is it's under attack in the United States if Trump has his way, and his entire administration and in retinue. It'll just be gone. So the interesting thing will be, as I've been thinking about, is well, what happens if those restrictions on things like public sector strikes and whatnot disappear? We could be in for some interesting times for sure. But yeah, like what has prevented, what has been the barrier, do you think, of labor unions developing the kind of vision you described that is centering the democratic ownership in addition to public ownership, um, in the fight to tackle the climate change crisis?
Yeah, let me just make a quick correction. I was actually talking about the Taylor Act instead instead of the Wagner Act. The Taylor law is the kind of law that makes the again another similar like an attack on working labour unions, but takes away the right to strike. It's this, we're seeing it broadened out further, that more and more labour unions. I mean, you know this better than us with the railways kind of coming under this, that your emergency services, and we're seeing this kind of happen more and more in Ontario, where the government's expanding the list of jobs that are kind of emergency, and then like using this as a way to take away the right to strike. So just to correct that there before I kind of get into this, but yeah, I think it's yeah, this is kind of like where, yeah, maybe I think I have the kind of most important contribution to kind of making and kind of putting all these kind of things together, and I think some of this work is ongoing, but I think I think things that have kind of stood in the way of developing this kind of vision are obviously, you talked about the 40 years of kind of defeat of the labour movement, this kind of narrowing of horizons, if you like, the idea that most not that labour unions are predominantly fighting for wages in this kind of defensive posture, which is understandable, right? It's completely understandable. We've had like massive inflation, so it's obviously understandable. But I think if we're not fighting on other kind of broader issues and broader fronts, such as the climate crisis, then we're kind of leaving that to corporations, leaving that to capital. So yeah, I kind of think that most trade unions have not kind of figured out to do with workers most affected by the transition. So that coalition that I kind of talked about in New York, they are doing some like amazing work in kind of like unionizing the workforce, the renewables workforce, and they're up front, that's their objective, but they leave the kind of harder to talk about things like uh, carbon heavy workers to the side, so like fossil fuel workers workers in plastics, who to be fair have got those great unionized jobs through incredible organizing efforts. And so I think that is one challenge, that they want to hold on to them, uh, and they don't want to have those kind of tough decisions. They also just don't fundamentally have the political power to transition these workers, right? So they also don't want to leave these workers behind and leave them in the scrap heap, which I think's completely understandable. But that's where I think there needs to be a broader vision of what's next. We have the kind of lessons of fossil fuel workers in particular were already being lost to automation. A lot of these jobs were going to automation before calls from climate movements to shut down production, which I think we kind of realise now. Climate movement was too fast in terms of calling for the shutdown, without having that kind of class rooted element to it, that these are workers, they can't be left without jobs. And of course, if you leave them without jobs, you're going to turn them away from climate politics. So there's been some recognition and some mending of that, but I think that's certainly, this Labour coalition that I look at in New York came out of the idea that Labour had to have its own lane. It had to realise its own kind of strategic potential. Needed to make its own demands, and I think it was a shame that and maybe it will be part of it in the future. But I think that those tough conversations can't be ignored, in Labour through building its power has to do that. And I think I mentioned earlier, so I won't take too long, but I think we can't ignore the rightward shift in unions. And I think, we look at the support that Trump's had with labour unions. We need to have an honest, sober conversation. It's the same here. The building trades in Ontario are really supportive of our right-wing government, and those jobs are guaranteed through real estate development. So we also need to talk about, like, okay, we need to get back to kind of the idea of like what should jobs be for. We need to contest this terrain of production, of like what should production be. And there's historical examples of that, like the Lucas plan in the UK. I talked about green jobs off Oshawa earlier, but workers again are well ahead of this, and I think it is about them building their power and then realizing the potential of their power and making these demands of government, that we need to recognize that current capitalist production is going to is leading us obviously to the climate crisis, and things are only going to get worse. So there needs to be a real conversation around conversion. What does it look like to convert our auto plants? What does it look like to have these like publicly democratically owned? But yeah, I think there are a lot of things in the way, and challenges for kind of realizing and bringing in that kind of climate action element. But I think it is a massive missed opportunity. But there's still time, and there's a lot of good work going on, whether that's folks going into Salton and unions in strategic sectors, whether that's happening with committees, with a lot of around plant conversions. Like labour unions should really now have committees set up in across the country, like talking about, okay, what does it look like to convert our plant? That should be workers that are driving that. And there was a great article by a bunch of UAWD workers in Jacobin that talked about the kind of idea of a worker-led EV, and I think it's those kind of things that we need to be fighting for.
100% agree. And I think it's important. It's an important question. You brought it up, and the, I'm based in Cleveland. I'm from Cleveland, and Ohio's a weird state because it is uh, actually a heavily unionized state, very working class. It's one of the Rust Belt areas where there was a lot of industrial manufacturing and things like that, where there has been time and again these eruptions of labor militancy, and essentially there have been there is a sort of established working class, almost like culture, like an identity. And
Mm,
yet I've seen uh recently that there are Ohio locals of the Teamsters and other unions that have been throwing their endorsements behind right wing candidates like Ramaswamy
right.
for governor, and that's been disturbing. And I have my own thoughts about why that's happening. And in short, I think it has to do with the fact that there is no left in the United States. I think
Right.
like we can like just say that like right out. Um, but even the sort of centrist liberal political institutions, in the Democratic Party being the primary one, it, in my view, has failed to actually provide what had been promised. Even like I had mentioned the New Deal earlier, the promises made by the sort of liberal status quo have failed to provide for the working class, and in
Yeah.
that, because there's no alternative other than you know
Yeah.
increasingly what looks like neo-fascism. um
Yeah.
we see a lot of these workers jumping ship and saying, okay, well, I haven't gotten anything out of the Democrats, so I'll go over to the GOP. Are you
Right.
seeing similar things in Canada? Are you seeing similar things maybe in Scotland or other places? Is this a global issue? In I guess yeah. Do you think I'm on point, or am I
Yeah.
missing something here?
No, I mean, I like so I was active in my own union. I've kind of like not been super active in the last year in my own kind of academic sector, uh, but here in Canada, so I know like that terrain pretty well here, and there's been some great work done thinking about folks that have talked about this kind of rightward shift. And yeah, I think you're absolutely on point that yeah, we are seeing it in Ontario. We're seeing it across Canada, and it is a very worrying trend. And I think you're right. A lot of workers are rolling the dice and taking the gamble on these kind of like strong men, far right, uh, characters who are promising them jobs. I mean, and I mean, the tough thing, like with the building trades thing, is like those jobs are being delivered as well. So I think there is a real tough conversation to have in terms of like what is the alternative to just continue like in Ontario, like, and I think it's like you say, a lot of these problems are just global, right? We have a housing crisis, and the idea is that is kind of hegemonic, is just to build, continue building, but that's exactly what like the developers are, and that's what the kind of billionaire developers want. But I think like you do see with like fights around rent control. I mean, Scotland's a really interesting example of a social movement, living rent, winning rent control, and there's a bunch of loopholes that have been brought in, but ultimately those kind of victories have to be won. And there's this idea that I'm sure you know better than me of like bargaining for the common good. There is no like there's a really interesting article in the Toronto Star a few years, I mean, a couple of years ago, where this pension retiree was a teacher. She was a teacher, and her pension was part of a asset management, some sort of some sort of asset manager was just continually upping her rent, and she basically on her own like worked this out that it was her own pension fund that was basically evicting her. So I think we totally got away from this idea, like that unions can fight on all fronts. There's no reason that again tenant unions have done incredible work, but this is also something that labour unions used to make demands on. There's the UAW for the first time in a generation, I believe, introduced the idea of work reduction in terms of like a climate policy that obviously wasn't successful and will take maybe a few like will not maybe will take a lot more kind of leverage and organisation and political power. But it was great to see that, these are the kind of policies that do bring working class people back, and this idea that they're lost and we can like come to this like centre, and there's something in there from the Democrats in the US and politicians here will talk about is nonsense. Like we cannot avoid organising, and we are from the working class, and that's exactly, it's the working class who we should be organising with. So again, most of these folks are just not involved in politics at all and not involved in their union, and that's the kind of challenge of our kind of lifetime, is to build that culture again where that build a culture within unions and build a vibrant political culture, whether it is unions, whether it's your social movement or whatever else, that do fight on these real material. That's the kind of point I'm getting at with Mandani's like affordability campaign. We need to meet workers where we're at, and most working class people today, or all working class people, are facing an affordability crisis. They can't afford, more and more can't afford food, etc. Bills, buses are getting more expensive. So if we're not talking about these issues, then it is going to be the right that talk about these issues. And yeah, they're not wrong for choosing to roll the dice on these actors. So I don't, of course, don't condemn voters, workers, or whatever else for choosing to roll the dice on these policies. It's the job of socialists and the role of working in labour unions to kind of like build this back up. But it is going to be a major challenge, but it's certainly the fight that we need to be in.
Absolutely. And to kind of end our on a positive note, what are the possibilities that we like, you've written that even, labor unions, even though they haven't necessarily developed the vision that we've been talking about, they still cannot afford to sit on the sidelines. That this is an existential debate, like we've we've been talking about. It's really uh it is really a zero sum game. I mean, we either step it up or everything everything's gonna collapse.
Right.
And so, what does that look like in terms of adopting that vision? What I guess like this is all theoretical because it's yet to be seen, but what possibilities are there? Like, I mean, what could we accomplish if we had a revived internationalist labor movement and the necessary component of a political movement behind it?
Big question to end on. No, I mean, again, like I think that there's no blueprint, there's no roadmap. This needs to be you know, I pointed to obviously public democratic ownership, which needs to be part of our politics. But yeah, I think this is what needs to be built. I think, and labour unions can play and should play a key part on that. But again, I don't want to get into this. I think sometimes we can fall into this kind of issue of blaming labour unions, bureaucracies, and things like that. And I think that's a mistake. I think labour unions will take struggles in themselves. If we don't get this motion passed such and this critical motion passed at a conference, a convention, sorry, then I think that shows us where our power's at, right? And that means we have not convinced enough workers. And I think, we need to think about what that strategic organizing needs to be. And I kind of use a lot of the late great Jane McAlevey in my work in terms of what that organization and what building that organization should look like. And I also just again do want to be sober. This is tough when we're in the kind of fight of our lives with the climate crisis, but and yeah, there is obviously a kind of boot on our neck, but I do also think these are generational fights. These are long term struggles, and of course, McAlevey also talked about raising expectations, which I think we absolutely need to do. We also need to be sober about. And yeah, what she also talked about, no easy victories, right? And I think we also need to be very kind of careful about that. And I think, I think a kind of good example of that is, I mean, I think a lot of us were very excited and by the UAW victories and their last strike and the amazing stand-up strike that they were able to have and mobilise and incredible organising that they were able to have. And I talked about that piece earlier, but I loved reading the Jacobin piece by Tolly Rinberg, Martha Greva and Chris Viola, who were making a kind of similar point that they weren't standing still on this, right? And the UAWD is really interesting in this sense that they were calling for a worker-led transition, and they were putting forward a lot of these the victories that they made in terms of climate action was to bring these electric vehicle battery plants under the National Master Agreement. But ultimately, those agreements were still with these private corporations who could, as we've seen across with deindustrialization, they can just pack up and leave when they want and continue and move to countries with lower labour standards. So again, this is going to be a major fight. I think we need to talk about and have a higher vision of capital controls. We need to talk about what it means for a kind of to talk about wielding the real power of the state so that it prioritizes social good. And again, we see the kind of with the EV transition, we see this kind of that is moving towards and moving very fastly towards individualized car ownership. But we know the kind of minerals and the impacts that that's going to have, and particularly in the global south. And we need to talk about and be fighting for universal public transit. We need to talk about what it means a true just transition means, and I think the kind of unprecedented, well, certainly in the last kind of couple of decades, ask that the UAW put in their last round of bargaining for a reduction in the work week needs to be central to that. I think that that's something that we've lost as a labour union. You know, we won the 5 day work week. We won the right to the weekend. Most people don't have that right today. You know, most people, working class people, are working more than 1 week. But yeah, these fights are going to be incredibly hard, and there's loads of places to kind of look at for inspirations. But yeah, I think that Labour has to play like a central role in that. And I think sometimes when we talk about Labour, it can be abstract, and we can kind of fall into this kind of service union, you know, ideology that again Jane McClevey kind of warned against. Like, we are the union, and we need to see ourselves as the Labour union, and so it's about cultivating that, and so that's the kind of idea that I'm getting at, and it's a tiny kind of fracture of the kind of work that's already been done, and I'm kind of taking on amazing work that's already been done there, and trying to like highlight a couple of things there. But yeah, obviously I don't see I see the role of political education is really important to that, but it's a tiny component compared to the kind of work of everyday workers, and kind of struggle in the shop floor, and outside. And I think that needs to happen. And I hope from my work, what I kind of at the kind of bare minimum that I can do is fill like a resource gap, right? Over the last 40 years, labour unions have, and worker centres as something that I can look at as the kind of like, we've lost a lot of worker centres, worker institutes who produced a lot of this research, who were doing the research with workers to produce these reports, and there's still like incredible work going on. But I think that's where I kind of like position myself, and then obviously trying to be a tiny part of this kind of broader movement.
Well, Vinnie Collins, thank you so much. I think I'm so glad that you were able to take the time to be on the program, and you're absolutely right. There are no shortcuts, as Jane says, and love to get you back on sometime in the near future. And is there anything before we go that you'd like to plug? Anything you're working on that folks can check out? And where can folks see more of your work? And anything you're working on that'll be put out in the near future?
Yeah, maybe I'll plug a couple of things. I'm part of an organisation here in Toronto called the Socialist Project, with folks like Sam Gindin, Greg Albo, and yeah, we're there's a lot of like really interesting organising going on with that. So for people that are in Toronto, definitely check out the website. And then for folks outside of that, I'm part of a network, and we would love to. And our aim, it just now, it really is too much in the kind of academic world, and we really want to kind of come away with that and kind of try and move towards what kind of folks like Trade Unions for Energy Democracy are doing. But we're a tiny kind of organisation. We're called Trade Union Labour Environmentalism. But we're international, and we're basically a bunch of kind of researchers looking at labour unions, and then in the climate crisis, trying to work together, put forward research. We host like a bunch of we put on like talks. We had Alicia Battistoni talk recently, and we have like a mini conference that we have next week. We're next year, and so yeah, check that out. Tule, Tule, Labour, spelled the other way with a U .org, for folks that are interested as well. It'd be great to have more people join that. And yeah, those are a couple of things that I'm kind of involved with. Yeah, would love to come back on as well. Thanks a lot for having me.